You know, one of the questions that Jonas chooses to deal with after he's established his argument for why he considers mortality in the sense of the can die, the perpetual presence of the possibility of death that is rooted in, let's call it metabolic existence, is whether it's all worth it. Right? If we think about, again, we're not talking about specifically human life. I can't emphasize that enough. When he talks about the burden of mortality, it is universal to all organic life, human, non-human. I mean, a plant is faced with the burden of mortality. A plant has to metabolize. A plant is perpetually faced with the possibility of its non-existence as well. But this universal philosophy, I suppose, of the organism is that the organism has to constantly make an effort to continue to be what it is. And if that effort isn't made, it will die. And even if the effort is made, if it's not under the right conditions, it will die. So the burden of mortality is really the burden of life, and the burden of life can be thought of as the perpetual deferment of death. So you can ask, what do we get out of this effort? Well, we get the chance to make more effort, as he says. I mean, what we get out of the constant strenuous affirmation of the self is a chance to affirm ourselves again anew and anew and anew. And so given, as he says, that much of life is suffering, and certainly looked at historically, that's got to be true for human beings in particular with their sensitivities. If we do look at it in an anthropocentric sense, specifically human sense, there is a question about whether it's, as he says, whether it's worth the candle, if you can find that line. And that's perhaps the biggest philosophical question is whether life is worth living, and if so, why. He doesn't really, he doesn't sort of give us a grand idea of the purpose of life or some overall good that we are directed towards, which would be more of a, classical philosophy, maybe, especially Aristotle. He rather says that there's at the bottom of everything, and this may be in many ways affected by the Holocaust. Being a sort of post-Holocaust Jewish philosopher, he often has that in mind. Faced with something like the Holocaust, or faced with the experience of those people who had to endure the concentration camps. One of the things that is remarked, there's a very famous book by a philosopher, psychologist named Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning, in which he himself, a survivor of Auschwitz, says that human beings, if they have something to live for, will do whatever they can to survive if they can find meaning in their lives. And I suppose Jonas's take on that is where he says that life says yes to itself. If I can find that, but you can find it for yourself. That ultimately, deep down, life says yes to itself, and perhaps it's not for any reason except that it is inclined to affirm itself. Well, after that, we move on to the second aspect of mortality, the getting beyond the can die to the will die, from the, as he says, the perpetual possibility of death to the ultimate certainty of death. As he says here, up to this point, we have been dealing with mortality as the possibility of death lurking in all life at all times, and countered continually by acts of self-preservation. That is the burden of mortality. ultimate certainty of death, intrinsic limitation of individual lifespans, is a different matter. And that is the meaning we have mostly in mind when we speak of our own mortality. Is certainly right about that. We usually think of mortality as the fact that someday we will die, not the perpetual possibility of death. But the question then is, how can he say that the certainty of death, the ultimate inevitability of death, is a kind of a blessing? He has some interesting things to say in this regard about the inevitability of death. And scientifically, maybe it's not so clear that we have to die, or at least that we have to die in the normal sort of lifespan within which human beings have always died, the 70, or the maybe slightly longer expected life of a person in a rich country these days, maybe more like 80 or 90. I don't know what you're thinking, but 70 used to really be the 70 used to be what people thought of as the natural lifespan. Of course, people did grow older than that, but not much. So how can the fact that we surely someday will die be seen as a blessing? Well, the key concept here is the one he borrows from his fellow philosopher and friend Hannah Arendt, this concept of natality. That is, if you look on the level of species, level of the community, mortality is the counterpart to natality, and natality is being born. That natality is new people constantly coming into the world. And without mortality, without people going out of the world, without organisms ultimately failing in that struggle to continue their existence, there would be no room for new people, which is an interesting thought experiment. That is, if we were to conquer death, biologically conquer death, as opposed to, say, later on we'll see that Paul Landsberg's Christian philosophy is a victory over death, but not a victory over organic death. But if we were to eliminate death, or make it a rarity, or extend the lifespan of human beings for centuries and centuries, which is certainly conceivable, if not scientifically possible, we don't really know, that would mean that people would have to stop being born, or at least people being born would become much more of a rarity, because there just simply wouldn't be room for them, or really resources for them. And this would be a disaster, says Jonas. This example here, where he says, whoever therefore relishes the cultural harvest of the ages in any of its many facets, and does not wish to be without it, and most surely the praiser and advocate of progress, should see in mortality a blessing and not a curse. We need new people to come into the world to see it with fresh eyes, to make innovations, to change the world, to keep it vital. His idea, I suppose, is if let's just say that we conquered death, and that meant more or less the people who were here now are the people who would always be here, that we would eventually fall into a kind of stagnant sameness. That without the new blood, let's say, or the new eyes, really, we would cease to innovate and change, and our culture and our society would become frozen and stagnant. That's an interesting argument. It certainly has some intuitive appeal. I'm not quite sure it's true. It seems to assume that as people get older, they lose the ability to innovate, to change things, to see the world in new ways. And it may, in fact, be true, but I'm not quite sure. But imagine that you could. You could live for centuries and centuries without growing older, as he says. You got to have that stipulation, like the beings that Gulliver meets, who are centuries old but have aged for centuries. We don't want that. It's not a world, he says, that any of us would really want. Now that's questionable. But then there is, of course, the question about whether you would just want it for yourself, and that's the last thing he deals with.